Thank you, Matthew. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Queen's Gallery. I'm Sophie Gordon, Head of Photographs for the Royal Collection. I'm also the curator of the Roger Fenton exhibition, which is on the gallery now. I'm so excited to be able to talk to Don tonight and to have this opportunity. It's a wonderful, I don't know if coincidence is the right word, but we have the Roger Fenton Crimean War photographs on here, and we have Don's photographs up at Tate Britain. And this pairing seemed like the perfect opportunity to bring the two together, the first war photographer and Don, who is one of the most extraordinary war photographers, and to see if we can use the photographs of the two of them to throw insights onto working practices, thoughts, techniques, and to see what emerges. So I will get going straight away. And this pairing will give you an idea of the sort of thing that we're going to do. We have on the left Don's photograph, which was taken outside Buckingham Palace in 1960, and next to it, a photograph by Roger Fenton of Buckingham Palace, the building in which we're all sitting, taken in around 1858. So I wanted to start by, and I should say that this is one of Don's earliest photographs, and it's actually the photograph that opens the Tate exhibition. Tell us how you first heard about Fenton. What was that first encounter like? Do you remember?
When I was a young photographer, which was an awful long time ago, and this picture here was my early kind of humble beginnings, really. And I was really groping my way to find out, who I was and what I wanted to be and where I wanted to go to. And I had no knowledge of photography. I came out of the Air Force with this camera of the square negative, and I just shuffled along the best way I could. But then I started meeting other photographers, and we started discussing photography. And there's only one way to learn about your journey forward is to go back to the beginning. And the difference between Roger Fenton and I was that I wasn't intending by this early stage, of course, going into war photography, but Roger Fenton, I look upon him as the father of war photography. His experience of war was much slower than mine because he couldn't record moving war the way I eventually did. Mm-hmm. So we all start somewhere in our lives, and we can only build upon it. And I think, the early photographers, in his case, of course, he would have learned his visual craft from, I know for a fact he went to study art. And we've all studied the great artists before us, before photography was invented. So we acquired this knowledge of composition and drama and so on and so on. So at the beginnings of my life, I just happened to be in front of Buckingham Palace one day because I worked in Berkeley Square and I took my lunch breaks in the park. And I saw these boys. You can tell by the size of the length of their trousers, which are meant to be short trousers, they're trying to get down past their knees. That it gives away the period of the 1960s. And then after that, clothing and styles changed. Mm-hmm. But I was encouraged by that picture because it was so innocent and so nice and charming.
Yes. And would you say that Fenton has been an influence throughout your career? Has he been someone that you've had in your mind at all?
No, I have to be honest, I wouldn't say that, because once I got past the Fenton period, I got involved with a man called Matthew Brady, who covered the American Civil War, and he covered it in a much more deeper way than Fenton. Fenton shied away from the casualties. There is a few images of amputees, but Matthew Brady went on to the battlefield just afterwards and photographed the bloated corpses. And Matthew Brady photographed men having amputees having their arms sawn off. Fenton would have probably fainted if he. I probably would too. But and then after Matthew Brady came other wars, and then finally the ultimate great hero of war photography was Robert Capa. Mm-hmm. And then there's things to be said about Robert Capa, because when he landed on the Omaha beach in the Second World War, he found himself in the most appalling danger. And he was very, very lucky to survive. And much of his film was destroyed when it got back to England in the darkroom, which was actually in Bond Street in London. It was a Time Life building. And a young boy who was in charge of the film left it in the drying cabinet, and he forgot about it, and he went back and he found the whole film all melting. So Capa was close to death on that beach. And there's only a few of his images, and they're all grainy and slightly all out of focus. But I noticed that Capa, after that experience, he didn't get as close to war anymore. He stood back from war the way Fenton. Mm-hmm. When you look at Fenton's pictures in this exhibition, they're like tableaus. They seem to be almost theatrical, and the postures of people involved are very almost bordering on arrogance, and the way they were posing up. And yet you can tell the atmosphere of the Crimea would have been a vile, filthy place. Lots of tummy upsets and all kinds of terrible things you don't want to hear about. But, so he made his pictures, he gave his pictures dignity, but he couldn't go beyond that because his exposure time was very long, so he couldn't record movement. And of course, sadly, he got there after most of the big battles had been accomplished.
Yes.
Were over.
Yes. Well, let's look at the next pairing. This is another early work by Don, taken in Berlin in 1961. And then next to it, we have what Fenton himself said was the first photograph that he took when he arrived in the Crimea. And it shows the old post office, one of the buildings that was part of Balaclava, where the British Army based themselves in 1855 whilst they were besieging the Russian city of Sevastopol. And here, what you were talking about, this sense of staging, is quite obvious, mm-hmm. I think, in this composition. What I'm interested to perhaps talk a little bit about here is how your role as a photographer gets defined. Is it the person who's commissioning you, the person who's paying you? Because this is something that Fenton struggled with a little bit. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's difficult to interpret his photographs in a consistent way. Mm-hmm. But I'm interested to know how you feel as a photographer going there and photographing in such challenging circumstances.
Well, if I can go back to the beginning, photography in this period of time and history, you had to be a gentleman to be able to afford to acquire the equipment and have the time off to take the photographs and so on and so on. And I came from the extreme end of the social class, so to speak. And I went to Berlin purely on my own steam. I went to the Observer newspaper in 1961. I just got associated with the Observer from those gang pictures I did early. And I said, I'm going to Berlin. And they said, well, we don't want you to go to Berlin. I said, well, it's too late. I bought the ticket. So I did what Fenton did. I mean, Fenton was commissioned, I believe. But I went on my own independently and wound up in Berlin with £23 in my pockets and no accommodation, not a word of German. And I was really alone and almost destitute from the word go. But we're looking at this picture of mine on the left, and I love the way you've juxtapositioned the pictures. They're both slightly destroyed buildings. I mean, one is an Art Deco building, and the other is just a kind of simple old kind of, made of stone building. But I mean, they are so different, and yet there is something, kind of strange about the way you've chosen them, and I can see why. And they're both very staged. I didn't stage my picture. That you can see he's asked these people not to move, otherwise you would have a totally blurred head. So, when I went to Berlin, I wasn't really a fully fledged photographer. I had the cheek of the devil, and I went. And I did find accommodation. Whereas Fenton he went to the Crimean War with a horse and cart where he did all his processing in the back and sent the film back to London. But that's another problem. I noticed when I read in the learning room that he sent his film back. Nearly 60 years of covering wars and revolutions, I never sent my film back. only on one occasion when I was leaving the city of Phnom Penh to go to the end of the war in Saigon. I air freighted my film back, went to Saigon, got arrested and thrown out of the country, and got back before my film came back. And I was terrified that my film was going to get lost in the post. It's, 30 rolls of film. But I mean, it's strange the way this man was handicapped by the slowness of his work. And I had all the speed in the world to take the quickest things you've ever seen moving, even men throwing hand grenades and actually stopping the hand grenade in midair. Yeah. Poor old Roger, I never had that privilege. Well,
But I don't, he would perhaps not have seen it as a handicap, though. That would have been how things were. And maybe that allowed him to take more time in composing the photographs, and they become something different because of that, perhaps. I mean, if you had to take quarter of an hour or half an hour to arrange every image.
No, 125th of a second, I'm sorry. Sorry, half an hour would have been an indulgence beyond the imagination. Poor old Roger, if he was doing something with a horse, dare that horse's head have moved, he would have had a totally out of focus horse head, and it would have ruined his picture. But I mean, it's really fascinating what we're talking about tonight, because as my time went on in war, I suffered from, mental concerns. I started thinking, is it right what I'm doing? Will people be angry? Instead of seeing this as a protest against war, will they see it as a protest against me? And, Fenton, when I look at his pictures, they were incredibly, and it must have taken half a second or something like that, but what he brought to his work was dignity. These men who you could see were covered in lice and fleas and God knows what, in these horrible old uniforms and all those horrible old facial hair, there would have been problems with hygiene.
Yes.
You can almost see it in the pictures that these men would have been sleeping in bivouac tents at night, and there would have been a definite kind of flea problem. But he's given them dignity in his pictures. They're all proud to be photographed, because photography was in such its infancy. For them, it would have been a moment of huge respect to be chosen.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, particularly he photographed men who'd fought in the charge of the Light Brigade as well. And those photographs, when they were shown to the Victorians, would have had such an impact, because that was seen as such an important moment in the Crimean War, and the bravery of those men was so significant. So he does give them extraordinary dignity, and I think that contributes to this myth or this legend of the charge.
Well, he couldn't go wrong, could he, Fenton? During that period, the Victorian period, they craved heroes. They loved anyone who dared to dare and go out there and take on the unthinkable. And so he was on a good move on that thing, and he probably knew that, and people would have been so thirsty to see what was going on where they couldn't be. But I think you and I talked earlier about eventually people did go out there and wanted to see for themselves, and it became a spectator sport. And we must not forget also that the officers and gentlemen took their wives and lived with their wives, and it became, a kind of strange war where you could take the wife to war and have all the comforts of marriage and things like that. So what we're talking about today is so fascinating, and the wars I've covered, sooner or later, they had nothing to do with men in uniforms and grand, uniforms. It became, the war was bringing greater pain and tragedy to the civilians.
Well, that takes us on to the next image. This photograph taken in Cyprus in 1964. Perhaps you could tell us what's going on in the photograph.
Well, this is my first war I covered in 1964. It was I'm in a Turkish village called Gazivaran, and this woman's just learnt that her husband was found dead under some orange trees in the early morning dew, which came down it wasn't in the summer, it was in the winter months in Cyprus. And strange enough, I was in the military in my RAF days doing my national service, which I didn't want to do. And I was stationed in a camp called Limassol, this is the very, very close to the Turkish village. So I had an affiliation with Cyprus and its kind of problems. And when I went to the Observer one day, the editor said to me, how would you consider going to cover the civil war in Cyprus? So this was my first baptism of war. And when I look at this picture, there was another photographer standing next to me. You know, he didn't quite get this picture. He's a great friend of mine. And I got this picture. But when I saw this picture, I realized that I had the makings of somebody who could compose very quickly, could see the emotional tragedy of this picture, with the young boy reaching out to console his mother. And I have to say this, but I shouldn't say it, but I thought, this is fantastic. I've got something really good going here. And it was really, I'm saying it openly and honestly, because I was thinking in the wrong way, really.
Did they know that they were being photographed?
Absolutely. But, you
yes.
know, when a person's in this much grief, they don't see you. All their mind is somewhere else. Their pain is present, but their mind is elsewhere. And the one curious thing about this village is this image is the kind of the two guys in the background who seem to be totally unconcerned about the kind of tragedy that's unfolding here.
Mm-hmm. Well, in this photograph, the little boy is the figure that really
trying to tell you more about the picture. Yes.
It's what really moves me.
Yes.
And I chose this photograph by Fenton to contrast it with. Fenton has photographed here two Russian boys who came out of the city of Sebastopol to search for food, and some British Army soldiers found these two boys hiding during a skirmish. They brought them back to the British camp and, for want of a better word, adopted them. They stayed with the British. They hung around with this officer, Colonel Brownrigg, and we really didn't know very much about them, other than what Roger Fenton wrote in a letter back to his wife. Since the exhibition has been up, quite interestingly, one of our visitors to the exhibition was so taken by this photograph that he went off and did some research and found out that one of the boys, Inkerman, actually did come back to Britain, was employed in the household of an earl, married, had a huge family, and lived until 1917 and had a very comfortable life back in Britain. But we don't know what happened to the other little boy. But for me, this has always been a very moving photograph because it's about the fate of children and the non-combatants. Mm-hmm. And I think looking at your photograph as well, it's about civilians.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was in Aleppo about 4 years ago when it was being shelled like you wouldn't imagine. And we were looking for something to eat, and we found there was one place that was, you know, frying up chickens. And so myself and the Times correspondent, we sat down, and suddenly two boys appeared. There always seems to be a team of two boys, and they started watching us eat. And it was the most uncomfortable meal I could have eaten because they were there watching every mouthful. So we got up and went away. But these two boys, I mean, you could put all connotations on those boys. They could have been spying for the Russians. You could take any imaginative thing you want about those two boys. But I mean, what appears to be nice about this picture, they've been clothed, they look very well fed. And so somebody's shown a great deal of kindness towards them. And they look incredibly Russian, those two boys.
So let's look at the next image. So we have a photograph from Vietnam taken in 1968. And alongside that, Fenton's photograph of the wounded Zouave and the vivandière, the woman, a French woman, who one of her roles would have been to act as a medic to deliver first aid, tending to him. And so perhaps you could start by telling us about your photograph.
Yes, there's been quite a great deal of controversy about this young man, this handsome man. He has a bullet wound in his chest, which was making the most appalling sucking noise. It's called a sucking wound, and I was with him when he got shot. He was near a school building, and a sniper picked him off, and they dragged him away, and this tank was there. They took him away, and I took this picture, and we've been in touch with the man who's the medic. But you see this kind of thing in war. I don't want to say this in the wrong way, but it's easy photographing these kind of things because they are there. I find Fenton's picture, without any, I'm not trying to degrade what he's done, but I find this picture slightly melodramatically kind of put up because it's just a bit too theatrical looking for me. But I mean, the poor man was doing the best he could. He could have probably found the most devastating things you wouldn't want to look at and still be able to photograph them, because those battlefields would have been littered with dead men with the most ghastly wounds.
Why do you think he didn't?
He may have been a truly great human being and felt he didn't want to inflict this. And probably he personally may not have wanted to look at himself anyway. If you were struck by one of those lead bullets about that big, I mean, it would plow through you and leave a wound as big as that at the back of where it was coming through. So he must have seen things he didn't really want to think about. Men and gentlemen like that, they didn't come from the rough and ready background. They would have been well educated and highly sensitive, I think, and probably couldn't take it,
Mm-hmm. And perhaps also a commercial aspect as well. Perhaps nobody would have wanted to look at those.
I don't think for a second. No, I mean, when his stuff came back and was in those kind of magazines, and they were illustrated by engravers and people like that, there would be no point in. They wouldn't even. I mean, when I worked on the Sunday Times, where I was commissioned to do these pictures, we didn't draw the line. We were taking a big gamble because who wants to open a magazine and see something really ghastly on a Sunday morning when it's meant to be the day of the Sabbath and a day of relaxation and joy? So we were really rolling the dice, inflicting these on our readers at the Sunday Times, but we got away with it for some reason.
But do you think there's any question over truthfulness here? I mean, is Fenton not telling the full story, and is that perhaps a negative thing? And perhaps your work could be seen as being more immediate and therefore more truthful. It's giving people a better idea. I mean, does it matter that Fenton's not showing this?
I think it's a very interesting question and difficult question to answer. I think, my picture up there, there's nothing to hide from there. You can see the whole thing, what's going on there. That man didn't survive. I received a letter from his parents, and they said, could you really explain how this happened to our son? I mean, I don't think for a second Fenton got letters from people. If he did, it took months to get there. But I think Fenton limited himself. That's my opinion. He limited himself, and whether he was protecting himself and protecting the public at the same time, self-censorship. I only protected myself when I saw men being executed. I didn't think I had the right, particularly from them. They didn't say to me, "Hey, Don, come and see, the end of my life." It was very bad it didn't take me long to make up my mind I wasn't going to do it. And I did see men executed, and it was the most awful thing to see. I think Fenton had a journey, and he had a specific journey, which he was going to documentate, something he knew the people at home, and he did it very well, really. And he showed the dignity and bravery of the men. I wouldn't want to have been injured in that war.
No.
If the chances of survival were pretty bad anyway, but with an injury from a musket ball, which would have been covered in gunpowder, which eventually, sooner or later, brings gangrene, you wouldn't have lasted, very long. You'd be okay if you got hit in the arm; they could saw it off. But so poor old Roger Fenton, I think he did an amazing job, really.
Well, let's look at the next pair. So we have what is probably your best-known photograph, or one of your best-known photographs, the shell-shocked Marine in Vietnam. And then next to it, Fenton's portrait of Lord Balboni, who was an officer in the Guards. He survived the war and returned to Britain, only to die a couple of years later. And at the time, the cause of his death was attributed to the hardships of the war. And this photograph has been described as the first photograph of shell shock.
My man was, post-traumatic stress is a very funny thing. I've been thinking about it for years now. I'm thinking, how can you assess it? How does it come about? Because, I spent 60 years covering wars, and I'm lucky I don't suffer from post-traumatic stress. I cured it by photographing landscape, calmed me down, and it took away all the bad dreams, which still come, But I love the comparison you've chosen in these two pictures, because the man, we've been in touch with the man. It took all those 50 years to find this man, then he refused to cooperate with me and the journalist from the Sunday Times. So he's still, I think he had more than post-traumatic stress. I think he's gone into a real, mental problem. So, which is not surprising when you see what you see in wars. I love the story of your man, Roger Fenton's man, because he does look worn out. He looks thoroughly worn out. He looks thoroughly fed up. And he's an officer, so he would have had much better treatment than the other people. And dying a few days when he got back to England, obviously he died from some illness, probably like cholera or something, or he may, he does look shell-shocked. And
I think he does. And I think it's been suggested that, in fact, he committed suicide. But because of his social class at the time, it would not have been made public.
Dressed up the excuse. Yeah, I think this rather handsome-looking man. You're quite. It's interesting what you brought up. There does seem to be a kind of a mental look upon him that is deranged slightly. He's messed up, just like the other man on the left. The other man is still messed up after 50 years. So we don't know whether he took his own life, Fenton's man, but and he had a strange name. It was
Balboni.
Do you think that's an Italian name?
Well, he's from Scotland.
I know, but there are lots of Italians live in Scotland. They don't have to have the Scottish name, but it's an amazing comparison, and he may well have been the first post-traumatic stress person, really.
It makes me wonder what Fenton was trying to show Victorian public at this time, because it is notably different from the other portraits that he does of officers. Many of them, the officer portraits that Fenton takes, are very beautifully composed. They have very clean backgrounds. Yeah. Everything's neat and tidy. The officers are well presented.
Yeah.
But this is completely different.
Yes, but if you look at the other pictures, I went around the exhibition again today on my own in depth, and what I noticed is there was nobody particularly smiling in those pictures. No. They obviously didn't like being there. And I think they all look like him in the end, a bit shabby, a bit run down. Slightly malnutritious kind of look about them. And you can see they've had enough. Mm-hmm. Looking at the pictures, they looked as if they were living in squalid shacks and places like that. And the whole thing looked very unpalatable to me. I would have loved to be in there. I would have loved to be in there. I would have done something like him, but I'd have got closer the way I did in this picture. I'd have got into the eyes and into the mind, into the soul. That's what I would have done. That's the one thing about him I didn't see. That's his nearest attempt to get into the soul of this man.
He's quite removed, isn't he, most of the time?
Yeah, there's something. I find this picture one of the most dramatic images of his whole collection, really.
So this next pairing shows Biafran soldiers who've obviously suffered a number of different injuries, including amputated legs. And alongside it, I've shown a work not by Fenton, but by photographic pair Cundall and Howlett, who photographed many of the returning soldiers once they came back to Britain. So lots of photographs of wounded soldiers. And many of these soldiers were visited by Queen Victoria, which is why photographs have ended up in the Royal Collection. It's a very interesting comparison, I find, very similar. I'm interested to know what sort of effect you thought or you hoped your photographs might have, because these photographs from the 19th century had a huge impact on the Victorian public, and they changed attitudes very quickly towards returning soldiers. There had been a feeling that the ordinary soldier perhaps was not worthy of attention, not worthy of help. But in the Crimean War, that started to change. And photography was one of the main reasons behind that, because it showed people what the impact of war truly was. So what do you feel about, I mean, what did your pictures do? Did you feel they changed? Did you want them to?
I think to start off with, it's incredibly complimentary, the way they sit together. They are as of one, you know. I also look at the rather handsome, good-looking men on the right who are quite calm, but, you know, their lives are ruined. You know, they would have gone back to no proper life the way we would have known life, even in the hard days of Victorian days, as simple men, cast out from the army, handicapped with missing limbs, you know, their lives would have been totally finished. The men on the left, they have the same dignity. They're waiting outside a Canadian aid distribution center in Biafra in 1968, 69, this period. And if I'd had a limb amputated, I'd be weeping. I'd be so depressed and down. I would not be looking the way these men are looking, even in both pictures. This good-looking man in the middle holding, comforting the blind man. You know, you've never seen a more beautiful man, and yet he's got a leg missing, but he's still sitting there, shining like with such dignity. And I find the man in the center of the other picture, the good-looking man, these two pictures, they say the same thing. It's quite extraordinary. And I've never seen the Fenton picture before. So I wasn't, you know, cashing in on what I'd seen before. The picture on the left, there were 20 or 30 men like those three men in a whole line. And I did a bigger picture, you know, a whole wide picture of 10 or 15 of them. Or there was a line that stretched around the corner of that aid center. And what a waste of life to be maimed like that and blind. And, you know, and whenever I see blind people, even if I see them in London, I want to look away. I can't bear to think that, you know, I have the privilege of seeing. And, you know, what happens is that you have to have a certain amount of sensitivity to be able to create these images. And I sometimes think, why have I done it? Because nobody takes any notice. We're here tonight looking at this, and, you know, we're understanding and as we go along here. But, you know, at the end of the day, this is only going to repeat itself many, many times over in the future. I haven't solved any problems by taking these images. But I think that must have been one of Fenton's most truest image of the price of war, really.
Do you hope that your photographs would have some sort of impact, though, to effect some sort of change?
I used to have that hope until I started going to more and more wars and seeing more and more awful things. I went to a war in Beirut once, and I was in the Christian side of Lebanon, Beirut, the city, and I was with the Christian phalange because you couldn't work. Sometimes you can't work with groups of people, they expel you. And someone said, you're only going to get anywhere here if you go with the Christians. So I went with the Christian phalange, and then I was in the Holiday Inn with them, which is still there today, the Holiday Inn, and still unfinished. It's as if it's been cursed and no one wants to develop it. And I was with a group of fighters, and they were overwhelmed, and I luckily had left. And the people who overwhelmed them started cutting lumps off of them and throwing them from the top of the roof alive, minus bits and pieces. And then I'd gone up to another group of phalange and said, we're going to clear the rats out today. And I said, what do you mean? They said, we're going to clear out the Palestinians in East Beirut. And that was a day of the biggest day of infamy I've ever seen. They were killing bunches of men and boys over the age of 14 in groups. And I was expelled, and then I managed to get back in the next day, and I saw mounds of torched bodies. They poured petrol over. And I thought, well, I've photographed all these things, and each year the wars were getting more and more terrible. So whatever I did, or whatever television and all the things you've ever seen, they're never going to stop these goings on, you know.
But it hasn't stopped you photographing either.
No,
when
old
you-
age has stopped me photographing. But also, when I was working at the Sunday Times, Rupert Murdoch acquired the Sunday Times, and the whole atmosphere of the Sunday Times changed. And the editor said one day, we're going to stop covering wars and children, skeletal children in Africa, and we're going to turn this magazine into a life and leisure magazine. And I knew that was my destiny, and I thought, you've only got a matter of time before, and I got the boot. So I missed many wars like Chechnya, Serbia, and I look back and I think I would have loved to have, completed all those wars, because I thought I was, it's only till now do I realize I was recording history. It wasn't me getting off on war. I was stockpiling modern history, which made me feel slightly proud of myself, because I had no education as a child and things. So I thought I had a useful purpose. But I feel useful tonight talking about what we're doing here. But when I got fired from the Sunday Times, it was probably fortunate that it was helpful that I didn't go to Chechnya and get killed, or somewhere else and get killed. I can be happily with you tonight. Yeah. So,
We're very grateful for that, yeah. So the next image we've selected is a different sort of photograph for you, I think. A photograph taken in Iraq in 1991 with this very striking composition. The action is happening right in the distance, on the horizon. And I'll just quickly show the Fenton image before we come back to this. The Fenton photograph that we've paired with it is this view of Sevastopol. So Fenton is looking towards the besieged city where the Russians are, and he's looking from what is probably the final point beyond which he could not proceed any further. He's looking towards Sevastopol, which is the Allies' objective at this point. So again, it's looking away, it's looking towards the horizon. So if we go back to your photograph, tell us what's going on.
In 1991, I went to northern Iraq, because you couldn't go south because Saddam was still in power. And I'm on the road to Kirkuk. It's one of the great oil installations, and very important place, Kirkuk, oil town. And for one day, the Kurds captured this town of Kirkuk, which is very dear to them. They believe it belongs to the heart of the Kurds and the Kurdistan. And I was there with a friend of mine, and he was an American television journalist. And we stood on a veranda. We were thrilled to be there because we got in and Kirkuk had fallen to the Kurds. And then it became towards the evening, and thousands of tracer bullets were coming towards us. And my friend said, time to leave. So we came down this road, and there were 3 other journalists who they were young, and they didn't catch on. It was time to leave. And they were captured by the Iraqi soldiers. And the first thing the Iraqis did when they caught one of them, they shot him dead on the spot. And another man who I know scarpered into a drainage tunnel and lay in there for 18 hours watching the legs of the Iraqi army walk by. And one day, a face suddenly looked in the tunnel and found my friend and dragged him out. So they slapped him around and blindfolded him and took him to Baghdad and kept him for 3 weeks and let him go. So we were very lucky, me and my friend, to get out that night. So the next day I went back to this road. I went to a tank bunker, which is where they would dig a tank into the ground. I put the tank in there, and on this, the tank had left and the Kurds had taken it over. And I was photographing the Kurds waiting for the onslaught, and they kept saying, Mister, you've got to leave. It's so dangerous. You've got to leave. And I said, I'll leave when it suits me. Thanks very much. And I did a few pictures. I walked down the road, and I was talking to another Kurdish fighter, and that happened. And you can see 2 men running, and you can see a lump of stuff in the top of it. But what's interesting about this picture is it's the same terrain as Fenton's empty landscape. I think his empty landscape is a masterpiece. A lot of people wouldn't understand this picture. I look upon it as the most beautiful visual image because I'm enjoying the space. Of course, you don't know what went on in that space, terrible things.
Yes.
But you see, there am I having men running in the distance and the explosion, and Roger Fenton couldn't do that.
No,
but he did that, though.
Yeah.
And that pleases me, that picture, because it shows space and it's almost tranquility looking at it.
Well, it's that emptiness, but it's also very bleak, isn't it?
I like bleakness, actually. It keeps other people away. I do a lot of pictures on Hadrian's Wall, and nothing gives me greater pleasure than to look around and see absolutely nobody there. I always do it in winter when it's snowy and bitterly, miserably cold, and I know nobody's going to be there. And you know, the idea of having it to yourself, you know, it gives you time to look at your camera and do it all right. So I love that picture.
It's a strange photograph for the 19th century.
A postcard, did you say?
A strange photograph for the 19th century.
It would make a good postcard as well, though.
Yes. So let's move on. So a photograph taken in Derry in 1971. And I'm interested here in this is very much about the moment, this instantaneous moment. It's a group of men running, capturing that action, but then the woman standing in the doorway and her expression is what really brings the whole image together. But it is a very, very precise moment. And I'm looking here at Fenton and what he could do, and his photographic van and this cumbersome, lumbering equipment that he had to carry around with him. And you look at the sort of group that Fenton had to do, which you've already spoken about and said it's a very theatrical, staged group. It gives them some dignity, but it's posed as well. He couldn't do what you were doing.
He never had the choice.
He never had that choice.
But he did have the choice of going in that van with the most appalling chemistry, which would have killed you. I mean, Julia Margaret Cameron did the same thing, you know. The chemistry they used, Julia Margaret Cameron's hands must have been the most appalling things, and Roger Fenton's. That chemistry would have made you almost blackened your hands and vile fingernails, and the smell and what the damage it did to your lungs in that van. And going back to my picture, if it wasn't for the woman in the doorway, it would just be an ordinary picture. She makes the picture, and I had nothing to do with it. She just happened to be there, and she brought such energy to the picture. Otherwise, taking pictures like that, which are so easy with modern film and the speed of film, I could do what he couldn't do, of course.
How many photographs do you think you would take on a particular...
To get that?
Well, when you were in Ireland, for example, how many would you have taken in the whole experience there?
Nice question, because I've always been incredibly stingy about film. Not that I couldn't afford it, but I used to. It was, you know, to me, film and the scientific discovery of film and knowing about people like Fenton, you know, everything I did about film. One of the cardinal rules in photography, you're in places of distress and importance and things like. It would be ghastly to run out of film. And sometimes people come up to you, other photographers say, "Oh, lend us a roll of film." And I would say, no. I'd have no compunction. And they'd say, "Oh, you stingy so-and-so." And I'd say, "It's your problem, not mine. You know, I'm not going to give you, you know, and put myself in your place." So and film, you know, you can only carry so much of it. And when I went to Vietnam during the war, I always took 30 rolls of film. And I treated it with the most reverence. And it was precious to me. And, you know, can you imagine being somewhere and seeing extraordinary things and not have any film left?
Have you ever lost any film?
No, I did something really terrible once, because we all make mistakes in our life, but I'm going to go public on this. The Observer said to me one day, "Go out to London Airport and photograph the control tower." So I went out there, and for some reason, I got past 35, which is the number of the film. And I thought, my God, there's extra film here. And then I went back to London, and they processed the film in the darkroom. They said, "By the way, that film was completely empty, you know." And what I hadn't done was that it hadn't taken up on the spool. so I had to go all the way back to London Airport. But, you know, it was only the control tower. It wasn't something really extraordinary. So
When Fenton went to the Crimea, he took 600 negatives with him, and he came back with around 300
and they were
images.
glass.
And they were glass.
And that poor old
plates.
horse had to drag them all the way there.
Yes.
Can you imagine 600 pieces of glass would be an enormous amount
Very
of weight.
heavy.
And the chemistry. But I can't figure out how he washed and dealt with these things in that little horse cart thing.
Very carefully, I imagine. It's very hard to do, but he was so good at it. By the time he got to the Crimea, he was already a master of the technique.
I see.
And he had two assistants. This is one of them. This is not Fenton sitting on the van. This is his assistant, Marcus Sparling.
But they all had beards, those people, I think. But I mean, when you have film and you know, the whole process of processing, you need lots of water. And where would you have got lots of water in a place like that, in that little van? So he had everything against him, if you think about it. And I had everything in my favor. I had speed. I had film that went on for 36 exposures. And you know, what I think he achieved was a great deal more than what I did, in a way. I would have liked to have been him. I wouldn't have known about speed of film in modern sense. And he must have enjoyed himself so much. And I do believe in the end he got ill himself with cholera.
That's right. On the way back.
On the way back.
Cholera.
Dysentery is bad enough, but I've seen people dying of cholera. He must have been a very hardy man to have survived that 4 months, you told me he was there.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. I thought he was there a lot longer.
Well, he came back with about 300 negatives. So that's probably pretty good going, even though that's 50% of what he took out. So he's done very well, I think. So this next photograph is probably Roger Fenton's best-known photograph, The Valley of the Shadow of Death, which shows a ravine which was named the Valley of the Shadow of Death by the British troops. And the title comes from one of the Psalms. It's not connected with the charge of the Light Brigade. It's not the site of the charge of the Light Brigade. But even at the time, in 1855, it was recognised as being one of his best photographs. If you wanted to buy this photograph, it was the most expensive of all his photographs that were put on sale afterwards. Now, I found a very striking comparison. This photograph, which is taken in France, the battlefield, the site of the Somme from the First World War. Perhaps you could tell us about this.
I was commissioned by the English Post Office to do a commemorative stamp of the Great War. And it was a subject I was quite, you know, happy to be offered to do. And I was having a lunch one day in a small bistro, and then I was, you know, a bit lost with myself. And I was having this lunch, and I thought, have a lunch and then think what you're going to do next. And a huge rainstorm came, and after my lunch, I drove away down the road. I saw this road, and I did a U-turn in the road with my little car, and I came back and I saw it, and I could see right away a very haunting image. Earlier, previous to this day, I was in an area where a Welsh regiment got really decimated in the Great War, and it became dusk. And I stood by the only tree that was in this vast landscape. And suddenly, by then, of course, it was really dusk, and I'd finished, and I was just hanging around because but I could feel a kind of vibration. I can bring on these things. I know it sounds absurd, but when you get emotionally, you know, free to roam, out of this tree came a tawny owl. And I thought, oh my God, a tawny owl. And then another one came out, and then another one, and another one. There must have been several. You do not get several tawny owls in one empty tree and an empty landscape. And the hair on the back of my neck really was standing up. And I felt I was having an experience that it went beyond anything I could imagine. It was really scary, and yet it was tingling me with all kinds of energy and thoughts. And I thought, and then when I went back to darkroom, and I eventually got around to printing processing the neg, and I looked at this neg, and this this image reminded me of that evening with that one tree and the tawny owls.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as a photographer, you can have license to think and imagine, because you have all these amazing experiences that often the man in the street doesn't have. And, you know, that's why my life has been so privileged. And I still think and behave like that, even though if I come across as looking like an old pensioner, I'm still experiencing emotional thoughts and energy and creativity. But coming to the other picture, this picture really gets to me, because we know he took another picture without the cannonballs. So we want to know, did some poor devil lug all those cannonballs and put them there? Or did he? I have an idea he may have done this picture first, but I think he's added a few on the road. Those ones on the road look too uniform to me.
Mm-hmm.
But let's not take his reputation away. It still has a meaningful voice, this picture. And
It feels as if the thing that both images share is the echoes of the past,
Yeah.
the ghosts of what was there before. So it's about the aftermath
Yeah.
of war for me. And it is completely empty, apart from the shot in this image. But that means your imagination just starts to take over, and you think about what happened there. We know that Fenton came under fire when he was taking this photograph.
Well, going back to what I did, when I see that road, I hear and see men singing, laughing, walking to possibly their death at the end of that horizon. And if I don't use my imagination like that, I can't conjure up. So what I'm saying is, I'm not telling lies. I'm not doctoring my work. I'm doctoring it with my emotion. And I do that with a lot of my work. I do it with my landscapes in England. I do lots of landscapes in England. I've just released a book on landscape. And when I stand in the landscape, I feel incredibly privileged to be alone there. If I see another person come, I get really angry. And it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to my camera. But I did see I've got a big love affair with Hadrian's Wall, because I find that really challenging. And one day, I was just about to take a picture, and a man walked in, and I thought, oh my God. So I whistled, and I said, which was a terrible thing to do. And then I felt very guilty when I took the picture, and I went rushing down, and he had his back to me. And he turned round, and he was an Asiatic man. And I said a really silly thing. I said, where are you from? And he said, Kazakhstan. And I thought, how amazing. He said, would you like to share my coffee? And I said, I do apologize for, I said, I just wanted to, he said, no, don't worry, have some coffee. And I thought, how strange that, I meet a man, he's from Kazakhstan, and there's something poetical about occasions. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're ordinary, but I always feel it's me that I have these wonderful, joyful, I've seen the most appalling things in this world, in wars, and I think I'm occasionally rewarded by certain circumstances. This picture here, a human person in that picture would have spoilt this picture for me.
Yes.
But those cannonballs, they disturbed me. We knew he did another one without the cannonballs, so we don't know whether he put them all in, the whole lot. It would have been a day's work putting those cannonballs in there.
But what's interesting is the image with the cannonballs is the one that he wanted to show, not the one without. So this is the one that
could
became...
give us some insight to the truth, maybe.
Perhaps it encourages the audience to think more about conflict and war, that evidence of...
Can I just bring up another very famous photograph that was taken by Robert Capa in 1937 or 36 or somewhere in the Spanish Civil War. He photographs a Spanish soldier or a rebel or whoever he was, falling back, having been hit with a bullet. It's the most controversial image in war that's ever been taken. This might be the second one. People say that Robert Capa staged the picture. Other people said, oh, that's okay. Photographers in the 30s and the 40s were notorious for staging pictures. And people say, well, that's okay. They're trying to tell you a story anyway. It doesn't have to be true. They're just trying to illustrate. But I don't go along with that. But I've done it myself once. I found a dead North Vietnamese soldier who had been sleeping near in Vietnam. And I saw some American soldiers turning him, trying to get souvenirs from his body. And they went away laughing and calling him a gook. And I thought, that's not nice to do that. This man, it's his country, he's given his life for, and calling him a gook is a nasty thing to do. And when they went away, I shoveled together his possessions that they found no interest in, little photographs, and I photographed it. It's the only time I've ever taken something that wasn't totally natural. But I thought, in a way, I was giving this dead man a voice and a reason, And I went to the south of France to a photographic festival 2 or 3 years ago, and I came up against a whole load of North Vietnamese soldiers. And they saw this picture, and they said, we're going to go back to Vietnam, we're going to find out who this boy was. But it's, covering war is, you have a totally open checkbook. There's so much going on, you can't get it all in.
But then you end up with these empty images as well, which are incredibly emotional, as we've said, even though there's nothing in them. And perhaps they are more powerful than those very specific, explicit images.
As they say, there's more than one ways of skinning a cat, dare I say that. But, you can take, there are so many photographers who have interpreted their visions of war or peace or revolutions. We all see it through different eyes. We all see it through different political reasons. As a photographer, I thought this is going to be good photography because I didn't have any background or any knowledge of anything. And I thought, I can take these pictures, keep my head down, and it's not going to be political. It's strange because everything I've ever done in photography has turned out to be political. If you photograph the landscape, that's under threat. War is awful. Famine is awful. Natural disasters. There's always a political, ending, and our government's doing enough. Are they responsible? So my whole life has been about politics, and it wasn't designed that way. I was going to hide behind the camera, as they say. It didn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Our last pair, I'm sad to say, I thought we would end with something peaceful. And I found this the most extraordinary pairing, in fact. When you visit Don's exhibition at Tate, which is an extraordinary, overwhelming experience, the exhibition ends with few still life images. And it's the most perfect ending because it's peaceful and calming and thoughtful, and it gives you that moment to think. And Roger Fenton has done something so similar here as well. When did you start taking this sort of photograph?
Well,
Why?
It does look as if I've been copying. But it's not totally true, because I knew this belonged to the Royal Photographic Society's collection, which has gone up to the north of England and now come back down here, rightfully so. I've always loved this picture. And then the picture on the left, I had an old farm in Hertfordshire, and I took this picture in the pigsty, the abandoned pigsty. I love the idea of the background looking, like a kind of painting in a way. I was trying to, copy the Dutch masters, which is a bit of a cheek in a way. But you shouldn't ever think you're doing wrong in trying in life, whatever you do. If you don't try, you don't arrive, or you don't know what's capable. I wasn't, doing a Fenton, but it seems as if I have. But then I moved on from that. I went to another house in the west of England, in Somerset. There was an old outdoor abandoned loo, because the house I live in is very old. And they had a whole piece of plastic as the roofing, and it had never been cleaned. And I thought to myself, that's very strange, because it looks like there's 100-year-old light coming through this place. So I got some plaster and cement, and I cemented the wall And then I went in the house and put my hand up the chimney and got some soot and came down and I stippled the wall to try and make it look like a canvas. And it's a bit of a cheat, really, but I wasn't harming anybody. I was trying to please myself. And I think, going back to Fenton, he was closing the chapter of his war, his life, and he was bringing his life to a peaceful ending. And because when you go to war, your life is never going to be peaceful again because you're going to be tormented for the rest of your life. And had he been Matthew Brady, I saw a picture in this wonderful book a curator from the Metropolitan Museum sent me the other day. There were pictures of the surgery in the American Civil War outside the surgery tent, and there were mounds of limbs that had been sawn off. And there was actually a picture of a man having his arm sawn off. Can you imagine? You could say, well, what purpose would that? And then they had pictures of men who had facial wounds, who'd been hit with musket shot and things, you know. But Fenton, he shied away from that. And I can tell by this picture of his that this was his journey to healing and freedom.
Well, I think that's a good point for us to pause and say thank you